It's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Sue Heaser. After studying archaeology at the University of Exeter, Sue worked as a finance assistant for the Museum of London and as an archaeological illustrator for historic England, where she developed an interest in jewelry making. Sue has become since then an expert in hot glass bead making using traditional techniques, and since 2016 she has been researching on Anglo-Saxon bead making, using her skills to better understand these techniques. She's currently working on a book about her findings and lending her expertise to a project at the British Museum. It's our great pleasure. Welcome, Sue Heaser.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. This is very lovely to be able to share my work with you all. So here we are, the experimental archaeology of Roman and early medieval bead making, and using the hot glass bead making skills to investigate ancient techniques. Oops, I'm going flying along. Right, here we are. So I'll start off with explaining my background, because I started in archaeology, as Benny has just said, and I went to art school and studied art, and I also went and studied archaeology at University of Exeter. And then I became a finance assistant and an archaeological illustrator. And after I'd done that for a while, I changed careers. I would have very much liked to stayed in archaeology, and it nearly broke my heart, but children started arriving and it became tricky and we moved into the countryside. So I had already been studying jewelry making to help with the illustration. And I decided that I would start making jewelry and seeing if I could make a career making and selling jewelry. So that was when I studied silversmithing, where I'd done quite a bit of this already and learnt enamelling, filigree, using clays in jewelry, the modern polymer clays and art clays, casting, moulding, resin, and then I got a bit tired of making all the jewelry. And as I had the illustration skills, I started outlining a book, and I was very lucky. I was accepted by publishers of major British publishers, and I started writing books on how to make jewelry. And then I moved on through illustrating, and my illustration and photography skills came in handy. And then I returned to archaeology. So it's given me a good career to start trying the practice of experimental archaeology, a lot of experience in the jewelry making arts. So this was the beginning of my career, and here is a beautiful necklace that was found in sort of just to the west of London, and here is my illustration of it. This is right at the beginning of my career, and in those days you didn't have any colour in reports at all, so everything had to be drawn, and you can see how I started in looking at these beads quite a long time ago. Then I went into jewelry making, and here are some examples of sort of things that I was making. This is in silver, this is enamel and bead making with clays. And then I started writing my third career, if you like, writing books, project books covering a wide range of crafts. And I did that for about 25 years. And then I felt I was getting quite weary of all the deadlines that you have in the big publishing world. And I had so loved archaeology as a young archaeologist, and I decided that I would turn down any future books and I would start some research into the greatest love of all, which was the jewelry. And I loved the early medieval period in particular, but I dabble in all the periods. I'm fascinated by the Iron Age as well, and the Viking period, and Roman, of course, and so on. So back into archaeology. I had always planned to return when I could, and ancient beads and beads making was my focus. And here I've got some lovely beads that I've recently seen from the Cambridge University Museum, where they very kindly let me photograph a lot of their beads, so many thanks to them. These are British beads made in Britain, and they do not seem to appear anywhere on mainland Europe. So this gives you a good indication that they actually are definitely made in Britain. So the aims of the research. Well, pretty soon I realized, reading reports, that archaeological reports can show little understanding of how beads are made. The terminology is at fault to start with. It doesn't overlap with hot glass bead making terminology, and that's unfortunate, because it's good to talk to the people practicing the craft today. The archaeology tends to have, in bead making, have made up their own descriptions and their own terms, and that is problematical when you're trying to communicate with glass bead makers. And there were errors and assumptions of how things were made, passing down the years in reports and copied. If somebody said a bead was made in one way, it was believed, and even if it was not like that at all. And typology was hampered in the same way, because if you lump beads into that have entirely different making techniques, put them into the same category, and then you do lots of analyses on this, it's inevitably going to result in mistakes. If you show a spot of where a distribution map of beads, and you've got lots of beads of different types in it, it's not really going to tell you very accurate information. So I decided, if I studied the making techniques and the tools and materials of bead makers, that should help with the understanding of both beads and their makers. So let's start looking at the beads. Now here's well, I'm starting with the cemeteries, really. In Britain, you have an awful lot of these 5th to 7th century. They're called Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, but that's being pushed into doubt now by recent work by people like Susan Oosthausen and others, and what Duncan Sayers is doing in Britain, looking at the genetic patterns of people. But anyway, we'll leave that aside for today. And this is a dot diagram or a distribution map of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries in Britain. And you can actually see that there are big gaps, but that doesn't mean necessarily there were no cemeteries there, because you inevitably in archaeology, you get excavation where there is development. And so, but certainly good clusters in some places, but this has to be taken with, as we say in English, a pinch of salt. You don't have to take it too seriously, because there may well be more cemeteries that have not yet been discovered. So inside the cemeteries, in the graves, mostly it's the women's graves that we are looking at. They had about at least half the women in these cemeteries were buried with all their clothes and their beads. And that gives you a wonderful, wonderful archive of material. And the beads on show in museums across Britain are only a tiny percentage of those that have been found. There are thousands packed away in storerooms. And how do I know? I've been visiting the storerooms. So glass beads, huge range of designs and colors. Most beads are found in graves dating from about 450 AD to 650 AD. And then Christianity came, and burying people with grave goods came to an end. So we've got about 200 years of cemeteries to look at. And this is from a cemetery in Eastern England. And it was where one of the early ones I started looking at. And this was easy. All the beads were put into boxes, delicately packed in tissue. That's now changed. And the more modern excavations, they are putting a single bead into every plastic bag, which makes photography absolutely a nightmare, because you have to take out one at a time so that you don't mix anything up, or you have to do it very carefully. But in the older ones, this was excavated quite a long time ago, and the beads are all in these lovely boxes, and you can arrange them and imagine how they might have been worn. So here they are. This is the modern way. Lots of little plastic bags. Quite a nightmare, really, for the budding photographer wanting to take photographs of the beads. But I've got on the left here, I've got a list of all the museums, or not all of them. I keep adding, and I'm very grateful to the way I have been welcomed into museums and allowed to look over the beads. And I'm very grateful for that, because they often have it's difficult times and they don't have the staff, but I have really seen an awful lot of beads now, thousands and thousands, and archaeological units as well. So this is the questions. if you're going to think, how are the beads made? So the process, identify the tools and the materials. That's the first thing to do. The second thing is to try making replica beads with the tools and materials that might have been used then. And then compare the replicas to the original beads. And similarities will indicate likely techniques. And I've often say now that if you get a replica bead to look almost identical to an ancient bead, then it's a pretty good chance that you have hit upon the way it was made in antiquity. So let's first look at the tools. And in fact, these are the tools that I have ended up with. I started looking at modern beadmakers' tools, and then I looked for Anglo-Saxon equivalents that was available, the tools that you found excavated in people's graves or on Anglo-Saxon sites. I was also looking at Europe as well. I wanted to broaden it. And I think they were using very much the same techniques, obviously, all across Europe. But Britain having sea all around it, made it a sort of isolated sample. So it was quite a good, although they were perfectly capable of going to or fro on the sea, but it was a slight barrier, more than you would get between countries in Europe. So it seemed quite a good sample, and it was handy as I live in Britain. So I restrict myself to tools that are similar to those excavated from Anglo-Saxon sites. So let's look what we've got here. Let's start at the tweezers. Tweezers, you will see, I will have a bit of video to show you how beads are made. You need a pointed tool, a needle or an awl for decoration purposes. You need a knife, that's for shaping, and to use as they overuse the word marver. Marvering means shaping, really, rolling a bead on a flat surface or pressing decoration into a bead. And these are tongs. I started off having shears like they use in glass blowing, but the glass blowing equipment is entirely different. It's a much different scale. And so I soon realized that the shears were of no use whatsoever when you're making beads, but a pair of tongs, which could be iron. These are wood that I keep soaked in water. I made them. And you'll see them being used in the video. And then, most important of all, this is a replica mandrel. Now, a mandrel is what you wind when you're making wound beads. You wind the glass onto it, a bit like winding honey onto a spoon. And I got this made by a blacksmith, a local blacksmith who's a traditional blacksmith and uses, well, if you like, very ancient techniques, Roman techniques, with his forge. And I measured the insides of lots of beads to find out what the shape of the mandrel would be. And it certainly seems to be tapered, because a lot of the holes inside the beads are tapered. So they're slightly thinner at one end than the other. And that makes them easier to get off. And also you go down to a fine point, and that means that you can make quite tiny beads on the very tip, or you can make bigger beads here. I mean, this is about 1 centimeter, 10 millimeters across. So you can have quite big holes in your beads, or quite little holes, depending where you put it on. And you dip your mandrel into a slip of clay slip, and that acts as a bead resist, so you can get your beads off more easily. I've also done some experiments, and you can use rock salt as well, in which case you can bang the beads off the mandrels. But that's a whole big subject, and I'm trying to stick lots, so we can cover that another day. So moving on. Now, Thomas Rhizome has written a book about the bead maker of Ribe, and he has done experiments. Ribe is in Denmark, and it was a seasonal market around the same time as what I'm looking at, sort of 500, 600, 700, those sort of dates. So pre-Viking, really, although I do say Viking here. And Thomas built a furnace, an experimental furnace. I've got pictures in the next slide to show you more about it. There's been many others who have been experimenting with different types of bead furnaces, and I decided I wasn't going to work on the furnaces. There is a paper on academia that's open access, which is that I've written, which is pulling together a lot of the work by different people, and also work on people have done in third world countries, looking at the types of furnaces used there. So we can get some pretty good ideas of how the furnaces might have looked, because they don't survive. They all seem to, well, once they're exposed, all you get left eventually when you're excavating is usually just the signs of an open hearth. So I decided I wasn't going to go down the furnace route. It's been very well covered by people more capable than I am on building these things. So I went for a simple blowtorch. This is what I use. It just uses gas. You can hardly adjust it at all, which that means I'm not using a modern, well, it is a modern blowtorch, but I'm not using the more advanced types where you can adjust the flame, you can get cool flame, hot flame, and so on. I thought I needed something that just gave me approximately the right temperature, which is around 800, 900 centigrade, and would mimic this sort of furnace, Thomas's volcano furnace, which is, as you can see, it's very like a volcano. So here are some photographs from Thomas's book, and he created a framework of twigs, green twigs. He then put a mixture, I think it was mud, clay, and horse manure, I think he used. And then I had to translate the book from Danish, sitting with a Danish dictionary, but now he's published it in English. So I wish I'd got that first. And then he found it was perfectly possible to not use any bellows and not use charcoal, and he could produce perfectly hot enough heat. And so here's my drawing of what I imagine is a bead maker, early medieval bead maker, with his all the things he needs. And so if this was left out in the open, it would soon disappear and just look like a little hearth, a little campfire, wouldn't it, once all that had dissolved away in the rain. So let's now look at materials. What did they use? So modern glass rods. This is what you can buy today. They're made in Murano in Venice. They're soda lime glass, very similar glass to the allegedly, that comes later, more thoughts on that later. They come in lovely colors. It's a very soft glass, and bead makers love this. It's called a feat glass, or Moretti, I think, in America. And it's what I was using to try all my experiments. Astonishingly, this is a picture from Wikipedia. It is of colored glass rods from an ancient Egyptian glass workshop, unspecified, from the 16th to the 14th century BC. I mean, extraordinary. Look how similar we have it. Even the colors look alike, but they would have been using similar oxides to color the glass. And I've also, as Thomas has pointed out, that at Reba there's and others, not just Thomas, there are a lot of, there's an awful lot of tesserae that they were obviously using as their raw materials, because tesserae are perfect to make a bead with. One tessera makes one bead, perfect. And they've also been found in other sites. So here are some modern tesserae. And a few little experiments. I tried making beads. Yes, absolutely fine. I'm not quite sure what the glass is. It's unspecified, but it's obviously the same soda lime. And I've been on the lookout for glass tesserae in Britain. And here we are. These have been found in Eastern England in a little pile all together. And look, they're all in the right colors for bead making. So was this a bead maker's stock that he perhaps buried, he or she? Certainly no problem with women making beads. I can make beads. You don't have to be strong. So, and there is a reference in Roman times to a woman bead maker. So we must not assume that it was men. And here is a photograph that I took from the web of a reconstructed glass bead making at Reba. Now, this isn't Thomas's version, and you can just see up here, they're using bellows, and that's another solution to the problem, using bellows to get the temperature really high up. But here they are, they've been using all the tessera to replicate what had been going on in Reba all that time ago. So let's start looking at the techniques. Well, yes, here's me. I learned how to make lampwork beads. It seemed to be the only solution. It was one of the few crafts I hadn't dabbled in by then. So I went to Mike Poole of Tillerman Beads in the north of Britain in Lancashire and spent a day with him. I didn't want to learn too much. I wanted to go and play, pretend I was an Anglo-Saxon who had seen somebody making beads and thought, I'm going to have a go at that. So I settled down, and this is my little tiny table. You don't need much room. It just shows how portable the whole thing could be. You could be a traveling bead maker, traveling around early medieval villages, building a little furnace wherever you got to, and settling down, because you only need a couple of grams of glass to make a bead. So you wouldn't need to carry very much with you either. So here are some of my earlier replica beads. I started experimenting quite soon, and I'm afraid I moved on very rapidly from the monochrome single color beads, although I do like the transparent ones, and these are melon beads, which are pretty widely found all over Europe. And yes, you get the Roman versions of those as well. So here we are. These twisted cables are the ones that are very definitely a British type. So how do you make it? Here's the process. Now I'm going to show you a video shortly, but I thought it would be useful to see this being done first in illustrations. So what you do is you get your tessera and you lay it on your knife and you preheat it over your flame. And because otherwise, if you put glass straight into a flame, it will shatter. It'll just spit all over the place. And how do I know? I've done it a lot. And then I would get a spare mandrel is fine, or you can use any rod, iron rod, which you would probably call a pontil rod, a pontil iron. And then what you heat the pontil over the flame until it goes bright red and glows really red hot. And then you press it onto the tessera. Then you can, hang on, I'm just moving that, right. Then you can melt it. It's a bit like melting cheese on the end of a fork over a campfire or a marshmallow. And it slowly rounds and starts glowing red hot. And then it starts slumping. That means, sagging down, and if it gets too hot, it'll start dripping. So that's when you can bring a mandrel in and wind it, turning it and wind this hot glass off. Again, a bit like handling syrup or honey. Then you remove the glass rod with the source on it, and you then just turn it. Keep it turning with your mandrel held very horizontal in the flame, so it's glowing hot, and the glass will naturally form itself into a perfect globe. You do not need to touch it. You don't need tools. You don't need to do anything. So anything where you see they say it's marvered, which is overused so badly, a globular bead, a round bead, would not be marvered. You could push against it with your knife if it started sagging or something like that, but it doesn't need to be shaped. Or you can use a glass rod like the ones I showed earlier. You heat the end of the glass rod and you use the rest of the glass rod as a handle and you wind it around your mandrel. So let's have a look, and here I will speak over the video. Here we go. So here we are, heating the end.
The mandrel is coated with clay slit so that the bead can be removed easily when cooled. The end of the glass rod is heated until it melts, and the hot glass is wound around the mandrel to make the bead.
So there it is all built up.
It is then heated in the flame and forms a perfect round shape.
There it goes. You need to put it into quickly once it's cooled a little bit.
Here are some examples of shaping and decorating beads. This shows working with wooden tongs that have been dipped in water to stop them burning. I am making a cylinder. And here I am using tweezers to pull a thread of glass, a stringer, that will be used to decorate beads. And here is the stringer being applied to a bead to make a wave pattern. The added glass sinks into the surface with more heating. Once the beads have been cooled, they are soaked on the end of the mandrels in water to soften the clay slip. And then, with a bit of effort, the mandrel is removed, and there is the finished bead. Mosaic beads are some of the most difficult to replicate. Slices from pre-made millefiori canes are applied to a mandrel and melted to make beads. These beads are found in small numbers across Europe, and their distinctive patterns give clues to the workshops they were made in. I have found that creating replica beads has given me insight into the techniques of the ancient bead makers and taught me how to look for evidence on the beads themselves, the marks from tools and how decorations were applied. This has shown how a lack of understanding of this in the past has led to errors in categorizing ancient beads and wrong assumptions on how they were made. I hope my research will correct this for the future and combined with modern elemental analysis to open up our understanding of the creation and trade of early medieval beads and the tastes and lifestyles of the women who wore them.
Right, so that I hope gave a little bit of insight into how the actual bead making process goes. And here they are again, just drawn out. You saw that being done. And then here it is being melted in. And you don't need to push this into the decoration into the bead. It will sink in beautifully. It's the one wonderful thing about it. And the resulting fire polishing that you get gives that fabulous shine on glass beads. And here is adding dots, which is another popular one. And this is quite tricky. You need a slightly thicker stringer for that. And then you dot it, melt the end, dot it down. But as this is so thin, it can go out of control very quickly. And then you have to pull it sharply away so that any little bit of tail of glass falls back into the dot. And then again, you melt them in. But you can come across quite a few beads in antiquity where you get a little trail where this thread has not dropped back properly. And you can see the mistakes. And mistakes are very revealing of when the poor bead maker has got into difficulties. And here is making, on the right-hand side, is making a cylinder bead, which we'll look at in a minute. So how do you make the twisted cables for decorating with this very British technique? And this is an East Anglian type, not found, it seems to have come out of East Anglia. I've been plotting maps of where these particular beads are, this specific type, and found them, in fact, very much centered around Cambridge. There seems to be, they move right out across Britain, but Cambridge does seem to have a very large number of them. So that might mean that there was a bead maker who developed this, or a group of bead makers, and they worked. And it could have been singles, or it could have been a family, whatever. Not vast numbers of people, I don't think, here. And this is all lamp work. It's all working over a small directed flame in the open air, not inside a furnace or with a larger furnace like you would use for glass making. So, and here on the other side, here are the beads decorated with these. You twist, you have a gob of yellow here, a gob of green glass there. You lay one over the top of the other and you heat them, and then you pull them apart, twisting in 2 directions as fast as you possibly can. And that results in this amazing twisty. These are about 2 millimeters thick, so they are quite thin, like spaghetti. So here's how these particular British beads were made. These are painted, here's one, and here is an original. This is a replica up here, and down here is a 6th century bead. And my replicas, I feel, are beginning to look very, very like the original ones. So you make a cylinder bead, you then lay the end of your twisty on the beginning at the top of the bead, and then you quickly rotate, and the twisted stringer winds itself round. And finally, here we do have some marvering to smooth the bead. It will sink in, but in order to keep the ends neat, you might roll again to get a nice round shape. And you can see here the shape of it, showing it. That's ended up with a bit. That's probably a wider twisty than I was using there. Slight differences. Now, this is to show how 2 different beads can be made in a completely different way. This bead looks very similar to that. You see, you've got a sort of chevron shape, and here it looks a bit finer, but to most eyes, it would probably be considered the same, but it's not. This one, can you see there's a gap there in the red between? This one was made like this. Twisties done in 2 different ways, a bit like a Z twist and an S twist. So you would have to twist in the 2 different ways and make 2 different twisties, and then you would lie them side by side on your bead. Here, you lay one twisty, a wider one, and then while it's still hot and molten, you drag a needle through. You can see how the needle has dragged through. So these are another type. These are, again, only found in Britain, and they're some of my favorites, and I find them spectacularly beautiful. They are about 20 millimeters diameter to 25 millimeters. They're pretty rare. I've been hunting, only about 20 were declared up until I started on this, and I found another 12 sort of unidentified lurking in museums, which is wonderful. And they're nearly always a transparent glass. This is transparent. This is a dark blue transparent glass, but it's got so it's lost its surface, so you can't see in. But here, this one was held in the light, and you can see how you've got this wonderful effect. They must have been spectacular. My fingers in the blue gloves up there, and my left hand holding the bead, my right hand holding my camera. So moving on, exotic imports. Probably about half the beads we're finding in Britain, which is less than originally claimed, I think, are certainly being imported from elsewhere. And these are pretty rare. There's not a huge variety of them in Britain. And they occur a lot. I went to Leiden Museum before all the pandemic and took lots of photographs, and they've got a lot of this sort of, particularly that one. These are all from British sites, but they are probably manufactured in the Near East, around sort of the Alexandria, Lebanon, Syria. Nobody's found a workshop. It would be absolutely wonderful if we could find it. So how are these made? Well, first you make the canes, and I'll show you that in a minute. Then you cut the cane into slices. And then there's 2 ways you can make the beads. You can make round beads by placing the canes onto the bead once you've made a basic bead, or you can make them into cylinders, and I will show you how I have tried out doing them. These are my replica beads, and these were one of the hardest of all. I used to almost approach the blowtorch with gloom in the morning, thinking, how many disasters will I have today? But I managed to get there in the end. So how do you make the canes? Well, you make them on end. It's a bit like the holiday candy that you can get in British seaside rock, where you have a pattern running all the way through. And you get a gob of glass. This is blue here. And I marked it with my knife to make the grooves. I then laid a hot stringer of yellow in to all the grooves all the way around. That gives you this. I then built up on top of the blue with a blue stringer. And then I went back and added to the yellow. So you keep building up as you go. This is one of several ways of making these beads. I've tried many different ways, and there really isn't time to go into all the different ones. I thought I'd just show you one example. This is what you end up with, and you shape it up with your tongs and get it all ready to go, keeping it hot, turning it, so all sides of it are onto the flame. You then get a glass rod, melt the end, and then squash the end to make what's called a Maria or a Maria, which is a sort of button end. This is all clear glass, and attach it to that. It will stick. Glass will stick to itself very quickly when hot. You then let it cool a little bit, and then you pull. And pulling it will make it go into a smaller diameter and elongate. And then at the end of it, as it's getting too stiff to pull any further, you give it a few tugs, and it ends up as a straight stick of glass. Now, these are about 1 centimeter across. And now I have started cutting them up to make the slices. Slices are about 5 millimeters. So these are the finished ones. So here are some beads made, and with the cane slices that I used to make them. So I've got 2 different types of floral ones. These were made as separate 4 at a time, but then put together. You build them up as elements. This was simply a red rod that I then wrapped with white, and then I wrapped with blue. And you can see here they are inserted, melted into the basic beads. It's quite good to make them square. You make them into a square cross section before you pull it, and then they keep the square cross section, and then they fit much more neatly together. So that's, but you don't have to. And the next slide shows keeping them round. Yes. So here we are. This is the way of making round beads, one way of making them. Mandrel heated, adding some little dots of glass onto the mandrel so that the slices will stick. Using my tweezers, I place the slices. They look a bit thin, actually, that one. Haven't drawn it quite right. So here are the slices applied on and now sticking to the mandrel. So I then melt them, and this is where I'm rolling it to push them and consolidate to get them to all stick together. And then, as before, you just keep rotating it in the flame, and there is the finished bead that has turned into a complete round with the bits of the different canes showing. So the other way, this is called rolled mat, or sometimes rolled pad method. You lay your slices down. Now, this is probably more likely to be made using a furnace. This would be a large workshop, churning it out, because it's quite difficult over a single flame or a small volcano furnace to get enough of a mass of glass to create big enough lengths of this. So although I can do it with my torch, I think these beads were most likely made in workshops, as I said earlier, in the Near East, in the Middle East, and they pulled the canes with, you can see pictures on YouTube of them pulling these canes in India, and they can end up sort of 3 or 4 meters long. So they start with a very big blob of glass, a big gob of glass. So what have we done here? We've laid the slices alongside each other, and with lengths of rod on either side. Here I've just put the cane slices together. And this, then you put them into your furnace, and here we are. They've just melted enough to touch, and that's called fusing. Now look, there's a big hole in the middle there, but in fact, as they're melted in, the central glass of these sinks. It's a most extraordinary phenomenon, and that will pull it into a floral. So these central bits will start getting less. So here we are, rolling a bead from a pre-fused mat of glass. You'd have to melt it again, or not melt it, but at least warm it until it's becoming flexible. And then you wrap it round your mandrel. Here it is, I'm rolling it on the marver to correct the shape, to make it a good cylinder. And here's the finished result, and you can see there is the the seam of where the mat joined itself. And on ancient beads, you can see this very clearly indeed. Sometimes older beads that slightly later beads that you get in Europe a lot have stripes here, striped canes have been pulled here for the ends, and you can definitely see the join on those. So having done all that and having worked out all these different ways of making the beads, and there are many, many more of them, I had an interesting discovery. All these theories assume that the glass I'm using has similar working properties to the glass used by ancient bead makers. So I had been on holiday in Scotland and we were near a medieval castle. I picked up, here it is, some beach glass. I love beach glass, it's so gorgeous. And I thought, well, this is likely to be ancient glass. I'm going to try and make some beads when I get back home. So I did. Disaster. My torch wasn't hot enough. I couldn't melt the glass enough. You can see I've managed to get it round a mandrel, but I've completely failed to melt it any further to get it into a round bead. I would have had to have sat there, I decided, for a long time to get to build up the heat, and it might not have even got there. And there's a side view of another one. So, oh my goodness, this is terrible. It could mean that I've worked out all these different techniques and they're wrong. I better get hold of some Roman glass, better try it, get some ancient glass. So I approached the Museum of London Archaeology and I said, please, this is so important. Would you let me have some of your glass? They have excavated quite a lot of, well, certainly Basinghall Street is a glass workshop, a Roman glass workshop excavated a few years ago, and the publication, very, very interesting publication. They were melting cullet. They were gathering, recycling their glass, as good Romans all did. And these are all little bits of broken vessels, bits of window glass, partly melted, all sorts. This is the natural color that you get of uncolored glass because of the iron in the mix will naturally color it this slightly pale blue or a pale green. You can then make it clear, white clear, water clear, by adding other oxides. So Mola were very kind to me and they finally agreed. They did quite a lot of decision making on their part. What? This woman wants to melt our artifacts, can't have that. So they did. They provided me with 250 grams of Roman glass. And this would have been the base glass used for a lot of early medieval beads because the chemical analysis of the Anglo-Saxon beads in Britain, there's been quite a bit done now, particularly of a big site called Eriswell. And that has shown that most of the beads, well, not certainly more than 50%, had Roman glass. It was colored glass, but the base glass started off as Roman glass. So I started doing some fusing tests. This is the little kiln I have that I can use for enameling and fusing glass. And I tried cutting up some pieces of glass and some Roman glass and fusing it all together at the same temperature for the same time to see what happened. And in the right-hand side, this is it looking into the kiln. I had to take pictures quickly before my camera melted, but it shows the glass beginning to slump. The sharp edges are beginning to round. So this is a controlled way of showing how heat affects glass. And here, the top pieces are Roman. And you can see how they have all rounded very nicely. And this is all different types and different softnesses, known softnesses of modern glass. And this is very hard glass. This is a sort of, they call it float glass, which is used for windows, pictures, and so on. And that needs a much higher temperature. And so you can see that one has stayed pretty square. This one too, another float glass. But these are glass, artisan glasses all round, and they have gone much more like the Roman glass. So the first signs looked good. It looked as though the Roman glass was going to be a lot softer than the medieval glass I had picked up underneath that castle. Then I did some stress tests. Now, if you use polarizing film, you can find where glass has got stresses. Now, the right-hand image shows just the bits of Roman cullet, scrap glass, and you see these halos. This is glass that's been laid onto a polarizing film with a light behind it, and then another polarizing film is put at right angles, like Polaroid sunglasses. And like Polaroid sunglasses will cut out glare, if you turn them at the two lots at right angles to each other, they will show where the stress is in the glass. And I was quite surprised that the colored, you see these glows here, these halos, it shows there was already a lot of stress in the Roman glass, had they not annealed their glass properly. Curious. So what I did was, each one of these strips is a known softness of glass, modern glass. The little blobs on top are all pieces of Roman glass. Now, they are all the number ones are cut from the same piece of glass, all the number twos, etc. There's two bits here because I was running out of the softest glass. Here, this is the very hard glass, and there's no halos at all because you can just about see there are cracks. The Roman glass was so different to this glass, this float glass, that the stress took over and it cracked. So once it cracks, the stress is released and you don't see a glow. This is just discoloration. This looks pretty close. This one, there's very little stress, just a bit. Here, there's still a lot of stress. There, not quite so much. Here, a lot. So move on again. This glass, this piece of Roman glass on this level is probably pretty similar to that. This is called a COE, 96 COE, which is a sort of medium softness glass. That one is like it. This one is still showing a lot of stress. This one, that looks very little stress. So that could be the same too. And this one is almost losing its stress. Move to the softest glass. This one is now unhappy, more stress. So it's close to that. Do you see how you work across? And these two both have got more stress again. So it's looking up as though a lot of it, except for that one, which looks happiest there. So I was beginning to see what the difference was. Then I did a viscosity test, just a practical test. The black glass is modern glass, and this is Roman glass. The modern glass is quite a soft glass. So I built it up in layers. This is over my torch. I wasn't using the kiln for this. Get to that point, and then, a bit like a cane, I pulled it. And where it shows that the Roman glass has considerably more viscosity to the modern glass. If I'd have tried another piece of Roman glass, I might have found it the same. And in fact, I did. I haven't got the photograph. I did move on, and I have found some of the Roman glass is more similar to others. So the Roman glass does vary. So then I moved on and I started making beads. I melted each blob like a tessera of Roman glass, and I measured the length of time it took to make to get to sagging, slumping point, and how long it would take to wind the bead, and how long before the bead would turn completely round, and then how long it took. I'm working with it until all the sign of the orange glow went out and it cooled enough. And I found again that the Roman glass is quite varied, but this was the one for making the beads, and it was an absolute dream to use. I like it better than the modern bead maker's glass. So huge sigh of relief. I had found that the Roman glass is wonderful for making beads with over a simple flame. There's lots more to share on that one. Obviously, this is just a very short overview. If anybody's scientifically minded on viscosity and physics, this shows the scale, the viscosity of glass. It's stiffer up here, more fluid down there, and this is temperature. So as the temperature rises, the glass follows a curve, getting more and more molten or less viscous. And the best working range is between these two temperatures. And that's another important thing. This is where you are working with your glass, and in glass blowing as well. This applies to that too. So here we have, each line is a different type of glass calculated from the chemical content that's published of these different glasses. And it shows they are quite different. But if I follow the line of the 2 Roman glasses, they are there happily in the middle of all the other types of glass. This one over here is lead glass, which means it starts getting very soft at the most low temperature. This green is Pyrex or borosilicate, and look, you need a very hot flame because it doesn't start melting until it gets to over 800. So that's a very, very high temperature glass. But there, happily in the middle, falls the Roman glass. So there's much more work still to do. Cambridge University has offered to chemically analyze the modern glass so that I can compare it, because the modern glass, they don't like to publish their recipes, but if we can actually see the chemical content, then I can do calculations and compare it theoretically, as well as doing the practical tests. But the initial results show that the Roman glass is extremely good to work with. It's lovely. It has an excellent working range and a forgiving handle in the flame. And I preferred it to modern lamp working glass when using it with my simple non-adjustable torch. So huge sigh of relief. All my techniques seem very, very sound when using ancient glass. So these experiments, my paper has been accepted for EXARC's conference in May, and I will be presenting the full results of it. And so I do hope that if you're interested, that you might like to join the EXARC conference. I sadly won't be able to make it to Poland, but you can follow online as well. And so that is the end. And again, I would like to express very much thanks to not just MOLA, but all these museums and archaeological institutions that have let me do this research, which has been such a fascinating journey. So thank you very much.